Now it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Joan Nassauer. She's someone I've worked with on projects that most of you have heard plenty about already, especially you students of mine. Joan was voted as a Fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architecture in 1992, and then a Fellow of the Council of the Educators of Landscape Architecture in 2007, a Distinguished Practitioner of Landscape Architecture of Landscape Ecology, in 1998 by the International Association for Landscape Ecology. And soon after that, she convinced me to be the treasurer for 2 terms of that association. And so I was there to see her also receive the Distinguished Scholar Award in 2007, and then Distinguished Landscape Ecologist Award in 2010. I think you're the only person that's received all 3 of the distinguished awards that are offered by that society. In addition, she received the award of the Rackham Distinguished Faculty Award from the University of Michigan in 2012, and so many other distinguished awards that I can't actually tell you about them all, but I can tell you that she's the kind of collaborator that really moves you to become the best that you are in doing your research, and I always find her work interesting and inspiring, so I'm going to let her talk to you about that.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for all the work we've done together. You know, my work is really fun for me, and some of the most fun I've had is when Mary and I have collaborated, so I'm very lucky. I'm not quite sure, is this on in the way you want it to be? It is, I just have to clip it on and we're good. All right. So I'm going to talk to you today about sprawl in the carbon cycle, but I'm actually going to speak about a whole suite of projects, 3 of them, that relate to ex-urban development. And one of them was funded by the Water and Watersheds program, relates to water. 2 relate more broadly to ecosystem services related to large lot residential development. And let me go back to say that in the work I'm going to end with today, and I will eventually get to a focus on carbon, the person who's worked very closely with me on this data related to carbon is Rachel Vischer, who is an MLA and Masters of Urban Planning student at the University of Michigan. So ex-urban development, which is a more polite way to talk about residential sprawl, is really a fact of life. Planning and zoning ordinances by local governments all over the country, and Oregon perhaps being the only real exception to this, but all over the country, excepting Oregon, tend to use large lot zoning as a means of controlling residential development. Ex-urban development means residential development that depends upon a private well and private septic system rather than being connected to a municipal system. And so the public health, safety, and welfare rationale for large lots is get a lot that's large enough, given the soils, that both a septic system and a well can fit on that lot and operate in a way that's healthy. Another reason for large lots that some local governments give, and this is also really pervasive, is to protect rural character. And so when you're protecting rural character, you might be designating that the smallest residential property in your local government area could be 40 acres. There are some local governments that require a 40-acre lot. So anywhere from half an acre to 40 acres fits in if you're thinking about ex-urban development, so big lots. So it's a fact of life given the way local governments work. It's also a fact of life that we have this amazing, huge legacy of ex-urban development that we live with in this country, even if it stopped today. Even 10 years ago, there was a larger area in ex-urban development in this country than all other forms of urban development combined. So if we're simply thinking about terrestrial and related aquatic ecosystem effects, you sort of have to look at ex-urban residential development, because there it is. Cook, Hall, and Larson provide this nice framework that they just published for thinking about residential landscapes as ecological systems. And so they first articulate, and I'm going to use it to talk about this work that I'm going to show you. They first talk about the ecology of residential landscapes. And they talk about the ecological properties, which I, as a landscape ecologist, would probably talk about ecological pattern and composition, but they talk about ecological properties, and that's good enough. Ecological function, and then they add, as distinct from those, ecosystem services. So let's think about what those ecological properties, functions, and services might be in the ex-urban landscapes that I'm going to talk about. We know from many studies that have been done in various parts of the country that in general, ex-urban development fragments habitats, it certainly disturbs habitats, it interrupts corridors, and it degrades downstream aquatic habitats. So these are all bad things. But these studies are generally fairly specific to a region, and the studies that I'm going to show you are quite specific to a region too. So there might be variations depending upon where this ex-urban development is happening in its ecosystem effects. So some questions we asked as we looked in the Midwest at ex-urban development in Southeast Michigan is, what would be the effect, would environmental impacts be magnified by larger lot sizes? That would be the sort of conventional wisdom. More sprawl, larger lot sizes, worse effect. And can certain ex-urban land cover designs, that is intentional land cover patterns, and their associated household behaviors, the behaviors that these designs elicit, reduce the impacts or perhaps even enhance ecosystem services, especially, and this is important, especially where, this is true in Michigan, new ex-urban development generally replaces cultivated land. So past land cover, like was it cultivated before, as well as the specific land use policy and planning, tax policy, lending conventions, mortgage lending conventions, lending to real estate developers, real estate practices, and very much developer choices are some of what Cook et al. Would call the legacy effects, sort of what you have when you look at ex-urban residential development. Those decisions have been made before the residential development takes place. And certainly these are variables that affect the ecology of residential ex-urban development. So this word design I'm going to use here in the way that actually Paul Upton and I used the term in a paper that was in Landscape Ecology a few years ago, in which we advocated that landscape ecologists should think about design as intentional landscape pattern making as really part of what we study as landscape ecologists. So design, as I say it here, includes everything that leads to these patterns. It includes planning, development, layout, land use restrictions, anything that leads to a pattern. Let's think of that as design, intentional choices about land cover pattern and composition. These things could affect ecosystem functions as well as household behaviors. And I guess I will use this after all, because these are actually 3 simulations that we've used in the web surveys that I'm going to tell you about later. So but they represent different choices, and this is a real place in Ann Arbor, which, like Corvallis, is a place in a small college town where there's lots of room for individual choice. So this front yard in Ann Arbor probably isn't one that we could find in just any old city in America, but it's one that works in Ann Arbor. Would it work in other parts, even of Southeast Michigan, where among the types of questions we asked related to preferences and behaviors? The way we thought about alternative covers for exurban development that could lead to greater ecosystem services was to experiment with designs, these are all simulations, that increase the area and continuous patch size of indigenous plants, that increases the number and size of trees over time, and as you might guess, that's the one that's most directly related to carbon storage, the title of this talk, that reduces the area in turf, and in a way that's kind of a comment on what's happening on a residential property that isn't turf, that is likely to have greater biodiversity and store more carbon. What enhances stormwater management, and what reduces the effective impervious area, so how you can hold more water on the land that is more pervious. So those are the kinds of things you're going to see in these alternatives. What we're trying to promote in the way of management decisions. So these three parts of the Cook et al. Framework are the ones that I'll talk about today. I'm going to talk about one study that really focuses on the kinds of decisions that can be made by developers. So the development patterns that could be chosen. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of studies that think about whether the primary drivers of more ecologically beneficial alternatives are at the neighborhood scale or the household scale and how those interact. And last, focusing on this carbon storage opportunity, I'll focus on our study where we've looked at management decisions and how this could be related to these other multiscalar factors. So this is a study that was, you can read from a paper that was published in 2004. This is an interdisciplinary project that I did with Dave Allen, who I'm guessing many of you know here, and Tom Johangen. And we were matching alternative subdivision designs, so whole subdivisions, that would have less or more of these ecosystem benefits with watersheds, first order watersheds that we selected within this large Huron River watershed. And my colleagues, Dave and Tom and their team, monitored those first order watersheds over the course of 2 years to measure various water quality indicators in those watersheds. So those were sort of like the real-time examples of these alternative subdivision designs. What we did is we took these alternative subdivision designs for 2 different sites. So these images are just representative. There were more different choices, more replications. We took these and asked adults who were homeowners not affiliated with the University of Michigan and Southeast Michigan to rate their preference for viewing this neighborhood out their window. They couldn't really tell us about their own house, but if you had to look at this out your window, what would you prefer? And they rated them, as I recall, on a 7-point scale. Briefly, the alternatives were conventional large lots of 2 to 4 hectares, so up to 10 acres. A very large lot, this would be your 40-acre lot, but what we called restoration cover, so a design that would essentially be restoration of, this was Minnesota, prairie, wetland, oak woodland, and clustered development that was surrounded by conservation agriculture with lots of prairie and woodland mixed in. So those were the types of watersheds that my colleagues found and measured over 2 years. And what they found is that the watersheds that represented the ecologically beneficial designs using aquatic macroinvertebrates as an indicator of water quality had much higher water quality in all these measures of total taxa and other more specific measures of taxa, much better than the conventional residential watersheds, and in Southeast Michigan, where what we're looking at is a lot of cultivated land, much, much better than the agricultural watersheds. And this is so important for people in the Midwest who have a kind of romance with agriculture to really integrate. And maybe it's obvious to all of you, but lots of the public does not understand how deleterious agriculture of many forms is to water quality downstream. So this is yet another demonstration of that. What about what the people wanted? These, I think there were about 250 people we surveyed in this study. First, other measures of water quality. And in these bars, orange represents agriculture on phosphorus, suspended materials, and nitrate. Green represents the ecologically beneficial subdivisions, and gray, or here light green, represents the conventional subdivisions. So you can see that for all of these storm events, the agriculture essentially was the worst on stream chemistry, and the ecologically beneficial subdivisions were the best. And in this case, both members of environmental groups, who we expect to respond differently to these alternatives, and the general public also preferred the ecologically beneficial alternatives as something they would see outside their window, you know, the big subdivision next door, compared with the conventional alternative. So in this case, we have a coincidence of what is ecologically beneficial and what is desired by the public. That isn't always true, and so that's why we need to push this further. One more part of that study was we looked at much smaller properties, and this was a collaboration with the resource economist Gloria Helfand that we did, in which she measured the willingness to pay of that same sample of people for as if these were their own yards, so much smaller properties. If this was your yard, what would you be willing to pay? And they used a paired comparison approach. What would you be willing to pay for each of these three alternatives? Again, these are only one of many similar alternatives we showed each of them, but the general design was an alternative that covered can't quite see this one, covered 3/4 of the front yard in native herbaceous plants, one that covered half the front yard in native herbaceous plants, and one that covered 3/4 of the front yard in native herbaceous plants with a shrub layer. You can see that the one they were willing to pay the least for in comparison with the conventional was with the shrub layer. They preferred all low flowering plants more. But we were frankly really shocked that this same sample of randomly selected people were willing to pay more for all of these than for the conventional alternative. In fact, it took us a while. You can see we didn't publish this till 2005. It took us a while to decide to publish it because we just had to make sure it was right. What I think is going on here is that part of the willingness to pay convention, to get willingness to pay estimates from people, is to give them information about what's going on. And so we were trying very hard to be even-handed, but we did say these are native plants, and we provided them with real cost estimates that we'd gotten from regional contractors about what it costs to install them and what the maintenance routine was. So these were all lower maintenance, and in fact they are lower maintenance after they get installed than a conventional alternative. And we think, or at least I think, that that might be part of what they were responding to in being willing to pay so much more per month. Now this includes both the cost of installation and maintenance over a 5-year window. So now, focusing more on the carbon cycle implications from the project that we're doing now, and I want to say here that this is part of a series of projects I've done where in every one of these collaborations, the geographer Dan Brown has been one of my collaborators. In the last two projects, Scott Page and Rick Riolo from the Center for Complex Systems have collaborated with us. And in this last project, Bill Curry, who models ecosystems, is a collaborator. So as I speak about this work, it's very much dependent on those interactions for us to come to the conclusions we want to come to. So what we do in my lab is that we develop these scenarios or select sample sites, and then we analyze the empirical social science data that we gather about these alternative landscape scenarios, and then they use those to model, in part, the landscape scenarios to model ecosystem services. And we developed behavioral typologies. Who's going to like what? Who's going to do what? And my colleagues in the Center for Complex Systems and Dan Brown used those to develop agent-based models. So that's how the pieces of our project tend to fit together. And I'm just going to be reporting on the empirical part now. So I'm going to tell you about one project that was part of one paper that was part of the first project. It's a series of 3 linked surveys. In 2005, we surveyed 494 homeowners in ex-urban addresses, so a much more specific population. These are the real people who own these kinds of properties and are making real household decisions. Then in 2009, we went back to just 26 of them and interviewed them for many hours about their behaviors for maintaining their properties. And Bill Curry and his team sampled each of their properties, different patch types in each of their properties, to determine the carbon content of various parts of the ecosystems. And so obviously he's using those in their models. Then just 2 years ago in the summer, we went back to that set of 500 homeowners and resurveyed them with some very specific questions about household behaviors that came out of those 2009 surveys. And I'm going to be reporting on the results of that resurvey data. I'm not happy with our response rate, but it's going to be adequate, I think, for what we need to know here, which was we had only an 11% response rate once we surveyed all of the 500 homeowners and some of their neighbors. So, but a paper that came out from the original survey relates to one of the 2 neighborhood scale concept, to the neighborhood scale concept I want to tell you about. And so this was from the survey of 500 ex-urban homeowners scattered in all of those gray areas around Detroit, and only in zip codes where local governments did not offer sewer and water. And I'm just going to tell you about one part of this survey. One thing we did in the survey, which covered all kinds of ground, is that near the end of the survey, after the respondents, we designed this web survey so it was sort of like being on a real estate shopping site. You got to choose your neighborhood, then you could choose your house within your price range. They first had to tell us how the market value of their house, so there was a lot of realism in this survey. Then you chose your neighborhood. The last thing just about you chose was what you wanted for your front yard. And each of the respondents was randomly assigned to one of 3 treatments. When the screen in which they were choosing their yard popped up, they would see either houses like this that had all conventional yards in the left-hand column, and all it would say is, these are your neighbors. It didn't say anything else about this condition, just these are your neighbors. Or it would show only yards that had additional perennial native cover or a lot of trees or some combination planted. Or it showed a mixed treatment, some conventional, some what we called ecologically innovative. So randomly, they saw one of those 3 things. Very briefly, then they had to rate on a Likert scale. They would have chosen this house. They had 6 houses to choose from, but someone chose this house. And then they would rate on a 7-point Likert scale their preference for their own front yard for this treatment, this one, or this one. So they rated them all. The results we thought were really stunning, because this simple information about what your neighbors' yards look like dramatically affected, in fact, reversed the preference rank depending upon what your neighbors' yards look like. So you wanted to match your neighbors. So we concluded that societal norms would still favor the all-turf yard and just a few trees do matter, because if all your neighbors have that, far and away, you rate this yard as what you would prefer for your own, far and away. But if all of your neighbors have this type of front yard, what we dubbed the ecologically innovative front yard, far and away, this is what you prefer for your own. Far and away. The ranks actually reverse among those 5 treatments. So neighbors matter more than societal norms, what the immediate neighbors are doing. And this speaks to the neighborhood scale, because if you want to introduce something new, on the level of a new subdivision, this is an incentive for local government and concerned citizens to work with developers to get the whole development to have this standard. But here's the good news for those of us who live in neighborhoods that we think could be better. Those who got the mixed treatment, some innovative, some conventional, were split in a tie. It was a bimodal distribution. But interestingly, these 2 were rated highest. By the way, the mature tree treatment, we thought that was going to be everyone's favorite. And it always just floated in the middle, down below these favorites. So what the inference we made from this is that parcel scale decisions, that is something I just decide on my own yard, are going to be more heterogeneous in neighborhoods that are more heterogeneous. If you have people who we've dubbed the brave innovators, if you can seed your neighborhood with a few brave innovators, expect more innovation to emerge. So that's the neighbor effect. Another effect that we uncovered, and this was we first uncovered this in the 2009 interview part of our work, is something that we've called the zone of care. Our colleague Derek Robinson had first done an analysis of all of Southeast Michigan at a 30-meter scale, and he'd observed that in Southeast Michigan, where we have had agriculture in the past, but really the biome is probably tends to a woody cover, that the larger the lot, the more the proportion of woody cover in the area. So areas that have a lot of really large lots tend to have more woody cover. And why is that? There could be lots of reasons. It could be that those areas have more rolling topography, more difficult to subdivide. But he suggested that there are limits to anthropogenic management of land within parcels with increasing size. So we kind of honed in on this in our interviews. And we discovered in these 26 in-depth interviews that there seemed to be a kind of a curve here. Now this merely represents all our data points. It doesn't include them all. But virtually all of the small and medium parcels, so essentially parcels under 1 acre in size, had zones of care. That is, areas that were mown, everything was mown and trimmed. That's what a zone of care is. Everything was mown and trimmed that was a whole acre. So if you own a parcel up to 1 acre, or imagine 160 acres being divided into parcels, all 1 acre, it gets entirely homogenized if this trend that we're seeing here holds elsewhere. However, if you own a parcel up to 6 acres in size, the largest parcel in our first small sample, the zone of care varies dramatically. And so we have some large parcels with relatively large zones of care, but the largest zone of care we got was 2 acres, whereas we got parcel sizes up to 6 acres. So that was the very largest one we even saw, was 2 acres. And you get some that are much smaller. You get people who are really doing something different with their property once they get a larger property. Well, why is that? Where's the neighbor effect there? And so this made us very curious, and this was one of the main things we looked at. And let me make it clear that the implication for carbon storage is that beyond the zone of care, and that's an area beyond the zone of care, you have a lot more carbon stored. That's the implication. That's what's interesting about this, not really what's happening where there's mown turf, but what's happening beyond that area. And this just illustrates the concept that this is a parcel boundary, this is the area within the zone of care, and this is the area within the parcel, but beyond the zone of care. From this, we developed a typology, and I won't focus on this typology, but it is something that we're continuing to query and test because it's important for the agent-based models of our larger project. So we developed a typology of types of householders and their habits in changing their properties that was based on parcel size and the neighbor effect. And so for the first N of 26 that we know extremely well, we know everything about their property, we identified 3 types of small parcel owners. By far the largest number of small parcel owners, those who have parcels less than, this one is less than half an acre, are the neat neighbors. Neat neighbors have a strong neighbor effect. They really care about matching their neighbors. On the other hand, there are people who have small parcels and they're lakeshore properties. And at least in our small interview sample, they don't care very much. So they aren't going to be as pressured to match what the neighbors are doing. And then we had these people, the nature neighbors. These are people who themselves may not have large trees on their property, or if they do, it's right at the back. But they've chosen properties that have large trees nearby. And so they value carbon-loaded landscapes and are, again, express less concern about matching the neighbors. Then we have the medium parcels, half an acre to a little over an acre. And we dubbed all of them, they were kind of homogeneous, and we dubbed them tree planters. Because the one thing they all had in common is they were out there planting trees. They'd planted lots and lots of trees. Even though a lot of them mowed all of their lawn, they still were planting trees all over it, and that had, of course, positive implications for carbon storage. I also find the large parcel owners very interesting because, again, they're the ones that are beyond that threshold. This is where it really starts to split. And there were 2 types, interestingly. Those who had the small zone of care on a large parcel, we dubbed improvers. They tended to be almost, they almost treated their property like a kind of wilderness in which to build things. They weren't homogenizing it. If anything, they were making it more heterogeneous. They were creating wetlands. They were creating woodlands. They were treating it like their own little piece of nature. The other large parcel owners who tended to have larger zones of care, we dubbed viewers. These were people who created a scene, including planting trees, but a scene to be viewed from their windows, and this is what they said. So this is the way our agent-based models are being populated with these 6 types of homeowners. Now, what about these 2 things, the neighbor effect and the zone of care, as it relates to some specific behaviors that we believe affect carbon storage? Lawn mowing. And we're interested in lawn mowing because areas that are not mown are more likely to store carbon. Irrigation, which may have a carbon storage effect in Michigan. Michigan is kind of a tough case because we get nice rain that's distributed across the year in most years. Leaf and litter removal, because it returns carbon to its local ecosystem, the presence of large trees, and the number of trees planted. So those are the behaviors we are keeping track of. And our belief is that parcel size, that is the zone of care, and the neighbor effect will, parcel size and the neighbor effect will, parcel size related to the zone of care and the neighbor effect, that is what's immediately adjacent to you, will interact in this typology to affect these behaviors. And here's what we've learned looking at this survey. Indeed, the proportion of yard mown is many more large property owners mow less than half of their property than do small and medium property owners. About a quarter of small and medium property owners self-reported that they mow less than half their property, but half of large property owners reported that. So that idea that there's more beyond the zone of care in large properties, especially as a proportion of a large property, seems to hold. And as a multiple measure to see if what they're telling us seems to also coincide with something else they tell us. We asked them how many hours they spent mowing each in the last month was the question. And you can see that large property owners do spend more time mowing than either medium or small property owners. We also found that, and this is a question about all forms of irrigation, whether you were watering trees or turf or your garden, that fully half of large property owners had not irrigated at all in the last month, whereas it was about a quarter of medium property owners and about 40% of small property owners had not irrigated at all. So small and medium property owners are doing more irrigating. Leaf disposal, leaf and litter disposal is also really interesting, I think, because sure enough, the large property owners, 2/3 of them are either leaving their leaves in place or just moving them to a different part of their property, like this, raking them over to a different part of their property. Whereas medium property owners, about 1/3 of them are moving them to a different part of their property, and another quarter are using a mulching mower, which has some benefits as well, though it has more carbon costs. And small property owners, 1/4 of them are taking their leaves to the curb to be taken away, and it's a much smaller proportion of medium or large property owners who are doing that. So we get more leaf litter in place on large and medium properties. Last then, what about planting trees? First, how many large trees do you have on your property? Half of the large property owners have more than 10 large trees. So you think, well, they have a lot more property to have trees on, right? So perhaps it isn't so surprising that more of them have more than 10 large trees. I think it is interesting, however, that about 1/4 of medium and small property owners have no large trees on their property, none. And then that the large property owners, half of whom have more than 10 large trees, are out there planting trees. They continue to plant trees. So there seems to, the large properties seem to evoke this tree planting response. So half of large property owners had planted more than 10 trees, and only about 1/4 of medium property owners had planted that many trees, and only 8% of small property owners. So the picture that emerges is that of large parcels that encompass more property that's too much to care for. So woody vegetation is either left or it's allowed to volunteer, and of large property owners who plant more trees as well, probably in the turfed areas of their properties, but there's just a lot of carbon stored per area in large properties compared with medium or small, particularly small. And one of the things I find personally really interesting about these results is that it flies in the face of the conventional wisdom of what makes good urban development, that density makes good urban development. Density does make good urban development, but our metropolitan areas also have very large areas that have large lots. And so for us to figure out what ecosystem services come out of those large lots, and to understand that the larger the lot, the better, that this medium place where a 1-acre lot, everyone has a place of their own. And I have to admit, as I'm saying that, guess who lives on a 1-acre lot? Me. But I mow only a portion of my property. Lots of carbon is there. But it demonstrates the potential for thinking about exurban landscapes as having benefits and benefits that we can exact more from. We asked lots of demographic questions, actually, and like so many surveys about how people treat their home landscapes, we came up with nothing. And this has been true in surveys of this sort all over the country. Or somebody will come up with one thing. In our case, we came up with people who have kids under 18 tend to mow more of their property. But income didn't make a difference, education didn't make a difference. We looked at a bunch of them, and that's generally been the case. So I think that's kind of interesting. And last, what about this neighbor effect? What did we learn from the 126 people in the most recent survey? Self-reporting, they tell us those who lived on small and medium properties, more than half of each told us that their own choices for their own yard were affected very much by having a home that fits well with the neighborhood. Whereas the large lots, only a quarter of them said they were affected very much by having a home that fits well in the neighborhood, and half of them, or almost half, said they were affected very little. So this might account for the fact that once you get over 1 acre, you get this divergence in the zone of care, and people just feel more free to do what suits them. So the way it looks to us is that parcel size and the neighbor effect do interact. That's the way it looks to us, to affect management behaviors that affect carbon storage. And that design really matters in each of these choices, but with the right design, diffusion of environmentally beneficial behaviors within the neighborhood may be more important for small and medium parcels, but for very large parcels, parcel size alone might be the most important device for achieving carbon storage. So that's an overview of several angles on how we think about some of the ecosystem benefits that we can achieve from residential large lot landscapes. That's a question.
So as far as carbon storage goes, do you accept, like in general, larger land parcels are found further away from urban centers? Then I guess my question there is leading into the fact that if they are further away from urban centers, do you think they'll have to consume, like if we're basing it off of carbon emissions from fuels and things like that? Have you done ever like a kind of a back of the envelope calculation of what's being absorbed in the landscape versus what they keep putting out to drive back and forth?
That's a really good and reasonable question, and we did think about that in the beginning, and continue to think about it. Have not done the calculation, but here's one of the reasons we haven't number one, it wasn't our focus, but why I think that it's important to think about the possibilities for these exurban landscapes sort of separate from that issue of carbon emissions from fossil fuels. The National Research Council did a really good report, I believe in 2008, on urban structure and density as it relates to carbon savings. And what they concluded is, first of all, that the efficiency of very dense cities that allow people to opt out of vehicle use, it's really not useful to infer from existing very dense cities what can happen with density that occurs in a more patchy way. And that might be, something for Oregon to think about as density gets called for in ways that are not necessarily compact. So their conclusion was you really can't infer from existing high-density cities what's going to happen when you achieve density in a more patchy way. But their second conclusion was more germane to this, which is that they calculated that more carbon efficiency could be achieved by employing existing technology for personal vehicles and changing personal vehicles than in changing the land use pattern. And so that may or may not be true, but given that we have these roughly 80 million acres of exurbia that we're living with, I think it is beneficial for us to just think about what we can do with these landscapes as our forms of transportation evolve. Yes?
Can you do any relation between these results and water features? For example, how much water is subsidized? What's the price of water for irrigating all of these greens? And I am missing the socioeconomic level of people you are talking about.
Yeah.
I don't think
So go, no, if you finish your question.
Yeah, I mean, how much the household earn that you're talking about? You're talking about the 100,000 a year minimum?
So about the income, we ask them about their annual incomes, and these are definitely people who are middle class to upper class to wealthy people. Absolutely. These are the people, when I look at this map, I'll show you again the map of the area that we were looking at. You know, with some exceptions, these are generally at least middle class people. But this isn't all a wealthy area, but it's middle class to wealthy. So again, this isn't a prescription for what should be, it's an analysis of what is. And that is who lives in exurbia. Related to water use, the landscapes that I showed you, Michigan is this funny place. In the analysis that Malisi et al. Did, again, I think their paper was in 2008, of turf grass in the United States, Michigan is in this, especially southeast Michigan, is in this funny band where we get sort of filtered lake effect precipitation, where you can grow turf without, this kind of turf, without irrigation in Michigan. That's why I said that our analysis about irrigation related to carbon loading may be a little unusual, and I've talked to Bill Curry, our ecosystem modeler, about this, because I understand from him that in general wet soils store more carbon. But the question is, do you gain that much more by irrigating in Michigan, where you already have a climate that in general is very, very friendly to turf? So so it's certainly very practical to think about green lawns in Michigan.
Interesting talk, and you know, it's quite a different set of themes that we normally get exposed to. So, you know, probably have some rather naive observations or questions. One of the things that we're going back to the earlier questioners and kind of looking at it from two different angles with respect to this kind of conclusion, really, about gee, bigger lots, more carbon. Number one, if you don't have a bigger lot, if you have a 1 acre lot versus 6 acre lot, that 5 acre differential is not going to be a lot. So if you're considering, I might get you to 1 acre or a 6 acre, so now it must be kept in mind, what is the alternative likely use of that other 5 acres? Mm-hmm. Because to say that, gee, we had, you know, greater carbon storage per unit area if you did 6 acres. Well, if you did infinitely many acres, then of course it's just native, you know, because you can only affect your little patch. And so if the comparison then is a forest that you're carving chunks out of, in fact, leaving 5 acres completely undeveloped is probably much better than having six acres with one little house and people carving it up and planting their little fruit trees. So I think that that comparison of just saying 1 acre patches versus 6 acre patches, naturally people will do less you know, changes on and have more, you know, less mowing essentially eventually. But that land, if you don't consider the alternative likely outcome with that land, then it seems a bit of a unfair. Well,
so let me say that, you know, the way that land development happens in America is that we included this in our in the middle study that I described. We describe 4 types of subdivisions, 4 ways that land that was previously agricultural turns into residential development. One is it's called a rural lot, and that's the exceptional case where a farmer, someone who's actually farming the land, will sell off a piece and is allowed by local zoning to sell off a piece for, you know, a single property on what remains a farm. And when you drive down a county road or a low volume highway and see these parcels now then along the highway, that's generally what you're seeing. But in the main, that conversion from agricultural to residential use happens in land transactions that are much, much larger. You know, 100 acres, 640 acres. And so the question is, once the kind of practical question is, once a developer or a speculator has purchased that land and it's ripening for development, what can the local authorities or local citizenry negotiate from, what can they get out of the discussion with the developer about what's going to happen to that square mile or that half a square mile, and that's kind of the way the question gets asked.
Yeah, I'm just saying though that typically the developer doesn't control the total number of people moving into an area. And so if we're going to have 10,000 new people living in Corvallis over the next 5 years, then if we choose to have those 10,000 people live on quarter-acre lots versus 6-acre lots, then that's really the macro vision of it. And so the 6-acre lots will chew up the landscape, whereas the quarter-acre lots won't. So I think yes, if you draw your lines around a piece of land that will be developed for after conclusion, you're right. But if you draw your lines around the overall community, maybe there's some issues.
So I think, as I understand the way you're framing it, that's a really plausible and practical way to frame this the way Oregon does land planning, but it's not the way it's done anywhere else in the country. So that's the issue. That you know, no other place says Washtenaw County needs to absorb 50,000 people. Where are we going to put them? That's just not the way they do it.
No, it's not the way we do it either. We don't dictate any kind who moves where. It's just that there's a natural number of people who accumulate in urban areas, and so I think is pretty much universal.
Well, so the way it happens is that it's a land speculation process, and so a parcel is owned for development, and the negotiation is about how it will be developed, not how many people it will accommodate. I mean, if that was the negotiation, how many people will it accommodate, then rationally we would have much greater density everywhere. But we didn't.
The other side is that dealing with the mileage thing, my calculation showed that a typical commuter who decides to live further away versus closer will be looking at approximately 12,000 pounds a year of carbon impact. So go into the 6-acre versus probably the 1 acre, which I think would be a pretty substantial fraction of the total accumulated benefit. So I do think that it's not immaterial, regardless of the car choice, that you will have a substantial carbon cost of having chosen this.
You know, I agree, and also take a look at the NRC report, see what you think about what they said. I mean, looking out to the future, this was the conclusion they drew. Just see what you think.
No, I think I agree with that.
Yeah.
From what I heard of it.
Yeah, yeah. But with current technology, the carbon costs for getting there are very, very, very high.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, that's all for now. I'll invite everyone to attend the reception downstairs in 3006. And let's thank Mr. Nassauer.